Part 5. We've done 5 of these. Well, this will be the 5th one that we've done. High-level creative strategy process. Just looking at the overall process we use at BrighterClick and that Charlie coaches in her course to focus on how we can develop high-performing creatives for ad accounts for our clients. We have gone through quite a bit. If you have not listened to any of the previous episodes or missed one, this is part 5. Go look for parts 1 through 4 on Spotify or wherever you are. Today, we're going to really be focusing on the graphic designer has received the brief. They've worked on the creative. Now it's time for internal QC, and it's time to hand off the creative to the client. And we're just imagining this is month 1. So this is where the pressure is the highest to make sure that we're meeting client expectations and learning client expectations still as well. So let's just start from there. We've already talked in the previous episode, part 4, about the brief handoff, making sure communication is there with the designer. Now it's on the designer to do a QC checklist of their own work before they hand it off to you to then do a check and make sure that it fits the brief, QC, client expectations, etc. We have something that we've built out in BrighterClick. I know you have QC checklists that you give away with your email newsletter as well, which you could share a little bit about, where we focus on taking the brand guide and we also focus on taking the onboarding form. And we build out a custom QC checklist for design based on each client's information given to us. And then as we get feedback from clients, brief over brief, we look to store that, because the worst thing that can happen, I know you shared this in a previous episode, I think it was part 3, was if the client gives us feedback on one brief and we do it again on the next brief, why do we keep having the same mistakes that way? So just maybe kind of talk through on your end what that QC checklist looks like. Maybe give a little bit of information on the QC checklist that you give away and what we expect from a designer when they are doing that check.
Yeah, cool. So I like to think of it in 2 stages from a QC perspective, because there are 2 parts really to getting a creative live. So you've got the client sign-off part, and then you've also got like your creative strategy sign-off part, if you like. So the creative strategist is ultimately responsible for delivering a creative that performs, right? So from brief all the way through to which creatives they allow to get launched in the ad account, the creative strategist needs to be making sure that that creative is as conversion optimized, data-led, psychology-driven as possible. But that's only one part. The creative strategist also needs to get the client to sign it off. And sometimes client demands can conflict directly with performance optimized creative demands. So I think it's really important to think of it in those 2 stages. The first one, like the kind of first thing that I do is I do the client checks. So I would be looking at, does it conform with brand guidelines? You know, is it free from anything really obvious like typos, you know, that kind of thing? This is just kind of design. It's more of like the design checklist. And then the second step is like the creative strategy checklist. So this, I think, if you have a designer that you're working with, I think you need to be really, really clear within the department of who is responsible for what. So when I was working in your team, Colby, it would be, I expect the designer to have read the brand guidelines, to understand them inside out, and to have applied them. I will have a scan through the brand guidelines. I don't leave it entirely to the designer, because I am the ultimate QC as the creative strategist. So it's not fair to leave everything to the designer. So I will have a look through the brand guidelines, make sure that I'm familiar with them, but I won't be checking against brand guidelines every single creative package that goes out, because it's just a massive duplication of work. And that's what I really need my designer to own and be responsible for, be accountable for, and to like deliver on that. So if you're working with a designer, I would say make that the designer's responsibility, but obviously be super clear about that. You know, set expectations, let them know that that's what you're expecting of them. If you're not working with a designer, maybe you're doing creatives yourself from templates. I don't know. There's like tons of different ways that agencies do this. Or perhaps, you know, if you as an agency or a media buyer aren't working with a designer in-house, maybe you're actually working with your client's designer. That's also super challenging sometimes, because designers that are good at logos and websites aren't necessarily going to be great at paid social creatives. So there's some basic things from a design perspective that I would QC first. So those are things like spelling errors. Does everything on on the creative have enough room to breathe, or does it feel too cramped? Brand guideline check, so colors, etc., making sure that the kind of obvious brand guideline bits and pieces are being met. I would also be looking at things like in the design part, I would be looking at, are they optimized for different placements? So if your designer's given you a 1x1 and a 9x16, I'd be checking exclusion zones on the 9x16 to make sure nothing's going to be concealed by CTA buttons or features of the different platforms. And that can be a nightmare, especially if you're doing TikTok. It's painful. There's like one little square where you can put text overlays on TikTok. It's not fun. Yeah, so that I would say is like the first step, is the kind of the basics of QC. And then the second step, or the second part, is more of a creative strategy checklist. So this one is a lot more about, how does the ad make me feel? Does it make me feel anything? Because if it doesn't, then we should probably look at that and rework it. You know, if it's a video, are the edits snappy enough? Is it holding my attention? Like, is there a motivator there? Is the first 3 seconds of the video a good hook? Like, can you look at that and be subjective and say, right, that's boring, or that's, you know, great. So there's, I would say, 2 different kind of stages to it. And I have, as you said, like I have checklists that I give away for free. If you want to go and grab those, you can just go to my website, thecreativestrategylab.com, and sign up for the newsletter. And then you get my checklists for free in the first, in the welcome email.
And I think one important thing to think about from the agency perspective is, I don't want to call it client flagging, but just having notes in your CRM or in your project management tool, wherever you keep information about clients, of what clients are really tight to their brand guidelines and what clients are not, right? Mm-hmm. Because then that can help navigate how meticulous you want to be meticulous on it. But some clients really want to be platform oriented. So proper font type, according to brand guideline, or left alignment, or logo placement, doesn't matter to them. Where some clients matters very, very much. And they care about the spacing height wise between words and all of that stuff as well, when it's multiple lines. So it can really depend on the client as well, and just being dynamic and making sure that you keep that in mind. And when it comes to revisions, when it comes to giving the graphic designer feedback and then them taking it, once again, I said this on the last episode, part 4, but I'll say it again, no questions is scary. So if they don't ask any questions when you give feedback or revisions, that can be a scary aspect, because you can't be certain, unless someone says something back to you or just communicates, that they know the type of revisions that you need. I highly expect, when a graphic designer receives revisions, that we have one round of revisions to get to where we need to go. And that's that, right? If we have proper communication, if we have the right people in the right seat, it should be one quick round of revisions. And ideally, we avoid revisions at all possible costs, because we did it right the first time that way as well.
Totally. And I think, you know, in the first couple of months of working with a brand, there probably will be 1 or 2 rounds of revisions there, whilst we're all getting to grips with the brand nuances, because you could read the brand guidelines inside out, memorize them, inscribe them in your brain, and the client might still have feedback that contradicts that, because there's a preference or there's something there. And that's fine. Like, don't be alarmed by that. Don't be upset by that. Don't be offended by that. You're learning, right? It's the first creative package. If it probably, actually, what you're saying here applies to the client as well, Colby. If you give creatives to the client and the client doesn't have any feedback, that's also, I would say, a signal to feel concerned, because sometimes they can be like, oh my God, you totally nailed it. Amazing. Wow, 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 which is great. We all want that the first time. Of course we do. But sometimes it's like, oh, actually, no, I would rather if it was like this, and I'd rather if it was like that. And I would strongly recommend that you take a really, really positive, collaborative response to that and say, awesome. Thank you so much for the feedback. That makes perfect sense. Like, now we know that, we're going to implement that to, you know, all of the packages going forwards, and saying things like, great, this is exactly what we want. This level of exchange on the first package. This is how we learn, you know, your brand and your style. Like, make it the best experience possible. Make it like you're grateful for the amends, because you should be. Don't fake that. Don't fake that gratitude. You should be grateful, because it means you're learning.
100%. And the moment that any of this, the designer to the creative strategist, vice versa, or the client to the agency, vice versa, turns into an us versus them situation, it's toxic. It's doomed, right?
It's red flag. Yeah.
The way that you frame, a creative strategist frames feedback to the designer, the way that the client frames feedback to the agency, really sets the tone for what that partnership is going to be like. And if it turns into that us versus them, it's hard to bear fruit. It's hard to give results that way. And as the creative strategist, it is also your job, though, to set up the QC or review process for the client properly, because you do not want to just give them a Google Drive and say, here's your creative, let us know what you think, right? Like, that's not good, because
Be prepared to go home and cry that day.
Yeah, the client is going to miss to me, the most important part of all that creative, which is all the time, energy, effort, and sweat that you put into researching their brand voice and researching their customers and coming up with motivators and coming up with strategy. Because this creative is not just designs and pretty ads, it is strategy. It is really strategy that goes into it. So we focus on, and I've said many times in different episodes, being dynamic with your creative or with your clients. And there's different ways that you can communicate depending on the client. Sometimes a Loom video is best. I love Loom videos. If you're going to tell me something, I don't want to get on a call. I'd rather consume it in a Loom video first and then get on a call, so I already know what I'm talking about. Could be a call, could be a Slack message with detail. It's different for every client. But one thing that is very important is, and we talked about this in a previous episode with Sarah Levenger, is giving them very specific things to focus on. Instead of just saying, do you approve this creative? Giving them specific things within the creative to look at. What's been your experience there, Charlie?
I would say the best thing you can possibly do, and I said you'll go home and cry that day, because if you say to a client, hey, what do you think of this? They're going to tell you what they think of it, right? If you ask for feedback, you're going to get feedback. You better believe they're going to find something to give you feedback on, and it might not be positive. So it's really important how you frame the sharing of the creatives. Now, one thing that I really love to do, because it holds you accountable for having a kick butt strategy, but B, it's really effective at communicating with the client the blood, sweat, and tears that has gone into that strategy. So what I love to do is share the hypothesis of each individual creative with the client alongside the creative. So maybe you're sending 10 creatives, and again, figure out what the client likes and do it that way. Maybe it's a Loom, maybe it's a spreadsheet with the link for creative one and then 2 bullet points in the spreadsheet around what you're trying to achieve with that creative. And you should always have a hypothesis or an objective. If you don't, go back to the drawing board, because you're then just throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. If you can't say, right, this is, pain point led because we saw this in the research and we've executed it in an us versus them theme because you're really strong against your competitors here. That could be 2 bullet points that you share with the creative when you're sending it for feedback. It's really, really important that you let the client know the thinking behind the creatives, because that's how you get the buy-in. If you give them an ad that's like, maybe focused on a pain point that they've come across once or twice before, but they didn't really know that it was, the most highly frequent one, even though you could have shared that on the call with them, you probably did on the onboarding call, but stuff doesn't stick. Like, just communicate. If you say to them, right, this is the most common pain point, which is why I've chosen it, and this is the theme that we've chosen because it shows X, Y, and Z, what is there not to like? If you have a good strategy and a good objective and a good hypothesis, there's no way the client's going to come back with negative feedback just for the hell of it. They might feel really strongly that they don't like the us versus them concept from a brand perspective. Fine, we can change the concept. Like, that's okay. But it's really, really difficult for a client to come back and say, we hate all of it, if you show them the strategy behind it.
Give them some positive. Negativity bias kind of applies here, which is, it's naturally we rest in negative and see negative a lot easier than we see positive as humans. This is not any specific client. This is just a psychological thing.
Just the brain.
It's a lot easier to find things that are bad than it is to find things that are good. So if you point out the good and then give them specific direction on approval or check off of specific things within the ads, it whittles down attention so that there's not as much time to just start nitpicking things that turns the QC and revision process into a mini or multiple day step as well.
I think one of the things that I like to do is I kind of take the default approach of sending everything to a client as an FYI. I wouldn't say FYI, here's your creatives, because that's just a bit borderline passive aggressively rude. But I purposefully don't use the language like, can I have your feedback? Like sending do you know what I mean? Like I probably would use the word approval because that's part of scope, is that the client gives final approval. But it's really, really about the positioning. Like, do you like these ads? I would never, ever say that, ever. I would send the creative with the hypothesis and say something like, hey, here's the ads. If they're good to go, we're going to get them live this week, like tomorrow. Something like that. So it feels more like an FYI, but you're giving them the hypothesis as well. So you're showing the strategy, and then they have an opportunity to speak up if they have a real big problem with it, because that should really be the only thing that they should be speaking up. If they have a really big problem, it should be, right, this is really off brand and we feel passionately about brand. Fine. That's totally cool. We can absolutely address that and make sure that that never happens again. Those things can happen in the first month. And like I said before, don't be upset. Don't take it personally. Be grateful that you've learned something, and then you won't like make that brand like misalignment again. But that should really be the only thing, because, you know, you mentioned it earlier that it comes back to like the communications around feedback, both internally with creative strategist and designer and with client. And we did a really great episode with Dina on this about she was the creative strategist for True Classic, and we were talking about client relationships, and she really nailed it. She was like, look, you're a human and I'm a human. We just should respect one another, you know, like it's not about nitpicking and this is one pixel out and this color is one shade off. And if you get to that level of feedback, then it's a bit of a red flag, like you said, Colby. But if you can talk to each other as human beings and have some respect for each other's expertise and profession, then there shouldn't be that many challenges.
Yeah, and it might be drawing extremes here, and if I am, tell me, but think about the creative review process with clients, like going to an art gallery. Like, I personally have a style of art that I like. You may have a style of art that you like. When we go into that art gallery, and if we're not reading the plaques on the wall, which doesn't give a lot of information, but it gives some, and we're just glancing, looking, the thing you're going to do is say, oh, don't like that, don't like that, don't like that. And we're just within 5 seconds bypassing hours and weeks and months of hard work and thought that went into this art that is in a
So
gallery,
true.
and it's probably worth millions and millions of dollars because we don't like that. I like Basquiat or whatever artist in his style that way, right? But I don't have the context of understanding where the world was at that time and how this art reflects it, and what the color theory is, because I don't even know much about that, or what the stroke patterns like or anything. But I don't like it, so it's all. That doesn't mean it's bad art. It's just not my taste that way.
Exactly. I love that analogy. I think that's fantastic. You know, like we could look at the Mona Lisa smile and I could look at it and go, gosh, she's miserable. Hate it. But if I don't understand like the context behind it and the significance and like, you know, the kind of the cultural and contextual information, then of course I'm gonna just dismissively give a yes no response, especially if the only thing that somebody asks me when they present it to me is like, hey, do you like this creative, or do you like this artwork? So again, it comes back to the positioning of it. Like, don't just say to your clients, do you like this, because they're going to make a millisecond split decision and ignore all of the hard work that you've put into it. You are selling yourself so short if you do that without sending, you know, the hypothesis, which should always be backed by your research process.
Have to give the context. With art, they have the benefit of it being in part like a money laundering thing, so you can just not understand it and you need to be in the society. That doesn't happen with Facebook ads. You either get it or you don't, and you need to approve it or you don't that way.
And it certainly doesn't happen with clients.
Yeah. So, well, we've covered quite a bit in this episode as well. We're on part 5 of building a high-level creative strategy process. We have 2 additional episodes that we are recording coming up. Will probably be some more, but in the next 2 episodes, we're going to be focusing on, once the creative has been approved by the client, how we go about moving into the actual testing phase and then auditing performance to understand what we need to do for the next brief.